My name is Colleen Boggs. I'm the director of the Leslie Center for the Humanities at Dartmouth, and it is a real pleasure and honor to be welcoming you to this kickoff session for the Digital Crucible conference that's taking place starting right here, right now, and going all through tomorrow. I know that many of you have traveled from far away, and especially appreciative of those who have traveled to get here, but I'm also very appreciative of the many colleagues I see in the audience. So thanks to everyone for being here with us this Monday afternoon. As directors of, I should say that this conference is one that the Leslie Center is co-organizing with the Newcomb Institute, and specifically with Dan Rockmore, who is the director of the Newcomb Institute, and he'll say a few words in a moment. And I was trying to reconstruct in coming here today some of the origins of this conference. As directors of these two centers, I think we both like to think about the productive cross-pollinations that can occur in a liberal arts environment. And the initial spark for this conference, I think, actually came out of us talking about some of the postdoc applications that the Newcomb Institute was receiving and some of the really exciting and energizing work that's being done in the humanities, in the computational sciences, and really at the intersection between the two. So in a way, I think both of us were really thinking about young scholars who are emerging out of PhD programs at this time, and where some of their research and some of their interests are going. There was, I think, with both of us, a sense that there were some important conversations to be had between the humanities and scholars who focus on computation, but that we really needed to create opportunities and environments to foster those conversations, because there are a lot of, I think, disciplinary and institutional, I don't even want to say barriers, but just differences in place at this point. So we really wanted to create a space to start having those conversations. And I think both of us recognize that humanists have by and large not been trained in computation. I know that many of us maybe didn't really even have email, the internet, at least the way we have it now when we were in graduate school. So there is, I think, a gap in terms of the kinds of training that has traditionally been in the humanities and the kind of training that is now becoming available, at least in some areas. But then on the computational side, I think there's also an interest in thinking about the ways in which scholars can engage with the methodologies, the concerns, the interests of the humanities. So we're really hoping that rather than just having two disciplines talk to one another, there will really be areas of emerging overlap, emerging interest, and a sense of intersectionality that develops. As you know from the program, this conference will showcase many different approaches. We try to set some thematic panels and are trying to showcase the different kinds of work that are possible, that are already being done. And in addition to energizing the larger field, we especially also wanted to appeal to colleagues here at Dartmouth. We're actually going to have a follow-up for this conference in spring, where we're going to put together some workshops for colleagues who are interested in pursuing something at the intersection of computation and the humanities, who come at this with various levels of interest, expertise, practice already, maybe people who are completely new to this and would just like to get some advice on how to pursue this kind of project. So we're also very much hoping that this conference will energize that second portion. In the 2 days ahead, I think that we will have a rich array of panels and of speakers to give us different ideas of where the humanities and computation might be in conversation with one another. And I also want to take this opportunity to express my thanks for the conversations that have already happened around this. First and foremost to Dan Rockmore, but then also to Alan Rydell, whom I saw a minute ago, there he is, Kirsten Luner, who's right there, and then also Michael Evans, who's in the back and who really helped to mastermind some of this conference. Last but not least, I want to give a big shout out to Victoria Smith, who's in the very back there and who really has done everything to make this conference a success. She has carried more than the Newcomb Institute's weight. She's also carried some of the Leslie Center's weight around organizing this, and I'm very, very grateful. So thank you very much. And I'm now going to cede the podium here to Dan.
Yeah, so this meeting comes right on the tales of a day in the library that was devoted to digital humanities kinds of things. And so our meeting in this day and the meeting that occurred today, and actually we even had a meeting this summer about patterns across the disciplines, and there will be future meetings this year, I hope is part of some groundswell of work that, as Colleen said, it's not, it shouldn't be one discipline colonizing another discipline, right? I mean, that's, you know, what's a joke about physicists? That physicists and data are like, you know, sharks and blood or something. You know, that's not the kind of environment we're trying to set up, but rather one in which we're all just working on interesting problems. We all know something, and can't we just all bring that to the problem? And so the particular focus of this meeting is on the intersection of the arts and humanities with quote-unquote big data. That's a pretty unimaginative but reasonably accurate title for a broad area of research in computational science that's devoted to trying to make sense out of vast collections of data, you know, not megabytes, terabytes, petabytes of data. And so what did I write here? Yeah, so I mean, so you'd certainly be hard-pressed to find a phenomenon that hasn't been reified in digital form these days. And so these tools, it's largely a bunch of tools, get deployed, if you like, in different areas. And this includes prominently in the objects of study that are the arts and humanities. In his eye-opening, I really love this book, A New History of the Humanities by Renz Bod, he cites a 19th century definition of the humanities as, quote, the disciplines that investigate the expressions of the human mind. So that's clearly big data, no matter how you slice it. And so while the scale of computing now being performed in the service of the humanities kinds of questions is without precedent, in truth, the computational sciences might be late in the game. People in the humanities have been dealing with huge outputs of information for a very, very long time, trying to codify it, trying to annotate it sensibly, and there's much to be learned from the ways in which scholars in those disciplines have worked. Music, poetry, art history, linguistics, and even literature are littered with such examples. And so our aim over this afternoon and tomorrow is not just to display a spectrum of applications of big data analytics in the humanities, but rather is to try to make clear the commonalities in the modes of inquiry as well as the targets of inquiry among all the people doing this kind of work, and hopefully to seed new collaborations in an interesting space. It's in this theme of shared purpose that it's my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker of our meeting, my dear friend and Santa Fe Institute colleague, David Krakauer, who will be speaking to us on the art of memory from chromosome to chronotope. David's a professor of genetics at the University of Wisconsin, where he's also director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. What was it?
It's okay.
The Leslie sign? All right. That's not the death of the humanities. So David's not just professor of genetics, but he's the director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, and this is an extraordinary interdisciplinary center at University of Wisconsin. It's home to scientists of many stripes, gamers, writers, artists, all sorts of creative people. And I encourage everybody here actually to wander at least around the web page. If you can't actually go there physically and see the space, you should at least see it virtually. It's really unbelievable. David's leadership of the WID follows a position as faculty chair at the Santa Fe Institute, which is generally regarded as the preeminent research center in the world in complex systems. And he's also had appointments at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study and Oxford University, where he received his DPhil in evolutionary theory after earning master's degrees in mathematics and computer science at University of London. He's collaborated over and written on an extraordinarily wide range of subjects, from genetics to history. David is perhaps the most wide-ranging thinker that I know. And I think I'm not the only one who sees this, since in 2012 he was included among Wired UK's Smart List as one of the 50 people who will change the world. If forced to come up with a one-sentence summary of the over 100 works that he's co-authored or authored, as well as the many externally funded projects he's managed, I suppose that which appears on his webpage suffices, and it reads, Krakauer's research focuses on the evolutionary history of information processing mechanisms in biology and culture. Today, he'll share with us thoughts on the central role of memory, a key ingredient in our digital crucible, and I very much look forward to it. So please join me in welcoming David Krakauer.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Dan. It's always sort of interesting to see a friend of yours talking about you in these formal terms when he's normally kicking your ass on a squash court. It just doesn't seem right. I got up very early this morning at about 3:30, so I'm of low affect. And so I apologize if I'm not as animated as I usually am, but I'm actually usually too animated, so this might be a good thing. Everyone can hear me? Good. So what I thought I would do is it's a slightly weird talk, but I want to talk about a theme that's evidently of interest to all of us, humanists and biologists and physicists and mathematicians, where it's not difficult to justify a project that might be deeply collaborative. And so it really doesn't matter who you are, you probably have an interest in memory systems of one kind or another. And so that's why I picked it, and it's something that I work on. As Dan said, my work is on the evolution of intelligence in the universe, and memory is an important part of intelligence, and somewhat deprecated, a very important part of intelligence. So I'll just start. I left those quotes up there because I think they're beautiful, and they sort of make my points. So let's get going. I want to talk about these elements of memory, and there'll be elements that are familiar to everybody. Issues of capacity, how much can be remembered, how much information is there in the world, how much information is there in your brain, how much knowledge is there in the world, are there limits? And how is that information preserved? This stuff, entropy, the second law, things thermalize, things fall apart. And one of the struggles that we're going to face in the future is how we're going to maintain or sift through all the huge amounts of data that we have and preserve the data and information that we consider valuable. Transmission mechanisms. Here I am engaging a very, very inefficient form of knowledge transfer, as we all know. But can we improve upon it? Is the MOOC an improvement upon this? Probably. And then what are the units of memory systems? In biology, my own field in genetics, they were genes for a long time. Richard Dawkins suggested analogically that perhaps there would be memes in culture, and that hasn't been a very effective concept. But are there units? Or is it some kind of very diffuse cloud of information that has a fundamentally different way of being propagated from our ancestors down to us? So those are the themes, and I'm going to come at it this way. I'm going to start off in biology and move towards the humanities, because that's what I've done. And I imagine for some of you, you'll be moving the other way, perhaps towards computation, not that it particularly matters. And I want to emphasize a few principles which are important to me. One of them is collaboration. And just for Dan, you'll like this, I think. Collaboration for me has the property of primeness. Good collaborations don't factorize. Okay? A bad collaboration has the following form. A collected the data, B analyzed the data, C, visualized the data, and D wrote the paper, right? That's not a good collaboration. I would much rather you said, who did what? You said, well, I actually don't know. We had this conversation, and somehow this synergistically emerged. We can't factorize it. So that's important to me. Other values will appear, but beauty is an important principle always. It's very important in the mathematical sciences. It's clearly important in the humanities. And something that's been somewhat underrated. We understand the beauty of symmetry, the beauty of affinities, but the beauty of difficulty. Very underrated, actually. I think difficult things are intrinsically beautiful. Okay, so let's start in biology, and this will be, as I said, a little bit autobiographical. I'm going to give you a sense of how this happened, and so these are things that I've worked on, and there's a very serendipitous path. There's no logic to any of this. Probably me. It's usually me when a phone rings when I'm giving a talk. So let's start with the genome. So the genome is a relatively new word in the biological sciences. It sort of really appeared in the 1960s after the discovery of the double helix. Before that, we had the word gene, and the word gene is typically associated with this monk, this Augustinian monk, Gregor Mendel. This is him in an older age, when he had already published his master work. He was born in Moravia, up in eastern Czechoslovakia, and he had wanted to be a school teacher, but he flunked his orals. And along with many other people at the time, if you had a scholarly interest, there weren't that many options available to you, especially if you came from an indigent background, as he did. And so he was advised to join a monastery where they had access to books. While he was there, he was sent to the University of Vienna to pick up some basic quantitative skills, and he studied with Doppler, as in the Doppler effect. And Doppler was very unimpressed by Mendel and kicked him out. And he went back to his monastery, but applied the sort of physical mathematical intuitions to the study of heredity. And he started actually on mice. He started with mammals, but the bishop of Borno, which is a city in which St. Thomas is based, was horrified that one of his monks was working on animal sex, which was something that they oughtn't to be thinking too much about, and suggested that he shift plants, which he did. And he shifted to pea plants, and this is in fact one of Mendel's paintings. So, it's interesting, it's never commented upon, it's just taken for granted that everyone had basic abilities in drawing, which is absolutely not true now. In fact, one of our faculty at WID, Linda Barry, the cartoonist, that's our primary target of interest, to try and understand why it is that we all basically stopped drawing out of a sense of insecurity when about 7 years old. And if you were to go to the abbey or the monastery now, expecting this beautiful rural idyll, this is what you'd find. It's preserved. It's something out of a science fiction movie. It's at the end of Solaris. There's the beautiful monastery, but it's surrounded by this pretty horrendous modern city. But you can still go on tours. And of course, what Mendel did is he very, very carefully tried to quantify the observations that he made on the pea plants and came to the conclusion that the memory of inheritance was discrete. It was the first quantum theory of inheritance. And he came up with the theories of recessivity and dominance with which most of you are familiar. And this is considered a revolutionary work, this work of 1865, but it was lost to memory, actually, until about 1900, when it was rediscovered in what's called the modern synthesis, when the ideas of genetics were reconciled with Darwin's theory of natural selection. Now, the thing about Mendel working on this simple memory system, this sort of atomic theory of memory in biology, is he didn't understand any of the mechanism. You have to understand, we didn't know about the cell, we didn't know about the structure of cells at the time, we didn't know about chromosomes. They were conjectured by Mendel, but they hadn't been visualized. And so memory, that is the memory, why is it that you look like your distant ancestor, even though at some very, very coarse level he'd understood that there were units that were propagated, he didn't know what those units were. And to understand those, we actually move out of biology to a physicist whose father was a botanist, a famous physicist. Can anyone, it's not easy actually at this age, does anyone recognize this chappie? Of course not. I wouldn't have recognized him. I'd recognize him later in life. That's Erwin Schrödinger as a young man, one of the great architects of quantum mechanics, which was the extraordinary revolution in our understanding of causality in the physical world that happened at the beginning of the 20th century. And he worked out, his contribution is called wave mechanics, and he made his contributions when he was in Zurich in his 20s and 30s. But for the sake of this story, this is him later. This is him in 1933. This is when he won the Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize with Paul Dirac just when he moved to Cambridge. It's one of those things that university provosts probably have nightmares about. In fact, he left as he got the Nobel Prize. It's an interesting story. These guys, for those of you, I don't know how many young folks there are in the room, but this revolution that took place, most of them when they're in their teens and early 20s, when they made their contributions. Werner Heisenberg, and Dirac were so young that when they went to pick up their Nobel Prizes in Stockholm, they went with their mums, not with their spouses and so on. Huh? And so, but interestingly, in 1939, Schrödinger, unlike Heisenberg, was a very, very strong opponent of the National Socialist regime. He had many Jewish colleagues at the university and decided to leave Austria-Germany. He was in Berlin. at this point, and he went to Dublin. He was invited by the Prime Minister of Dublin to set up a new institute for advanced study at the University of Dublin. He was an interesting person. He had many, many affairs. He had many, many illegitimate children. It's an entirely separate story to talk about the black notebooks. There's a sort of a little subcult of students of the so-called black notebooks of Schrödinger. But when he wasn't having affairs, he wrote this book that is called What is Life? And it's one of the great masterworks of interdisciplinary thinking, trying to explain biological phenomena based on physical principles. And I want to read you a little bit of this book, because one of the reasons I think why this book is so important is not just because of its factual insights, because it's beautifully written. It's a very lyrically written book. It's a bit like Tris Tropique, right? It's not just a work of ethnography or anthropology. It's actually a beautiful book in its own right. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of this. So this is a section where he actually suggests what the underlying structure of the hereditary particle might be, because physicists couldn't understand how something as complex of a body could be propagated from one generation to another. There's nothing in physics that was consistent with that observation. So this is what he says. In physics, we have dealt hitherto only with periodic crystals. To a humble physicist's mind, these are very interesting and complicated objects. They constitute one of the most fascinating and complex material structures by which inanimate nature puzzles his wits. Yet compared with the aperiodic crystal, they're rather plain and dull. The difference in structure is often of the same kind as that between an ordinary wallpaper, in which the same pattern is repeated again and again in regular periodicity, and a masterpiece of embroidery, say a Raphael tapestry, which shows no dull repetition, but an elaborate, coherent, meaningful design traced by the great master. Right? So this was his suggestion that would be the central physical form of the hereditary memory particle, an aperiodic crystal. He goes on, in fact, to speculate on the nature of free will, because he says, well, if it all comes down to this complex physics, where does free will figure in the debate? And so he doesn't avoid it, he doesn't punt on the topic, he discusses it, and he does it beautifully. And here's just a short paragraph. When in the puppet show of dreams, we hold in hand the strings of quite a number of actors, controlling their actions and their speech, we are not aware of this being so. Only one of them is myself, the dreamer. In him, I act and speak immediately, while I may be awaiting eagerly and anxiously what another one will reply. It almost sounds like a short essay by Eugenio Montale or Calvino. I mean, this is beautiful stuff. And this is an interesting, unremarked upon fact of successful scientific books, that they're often written beautifully. And Darwin, The Origin of Species, is the canonical example that Beer has worked on. So here is the vindication of the aperiodic crystal. Here is the aperiodic crystal, the DNA molecule. And this is the young James Watson with the 12 years older Francis Crick, not the 12-year-old Francis Crick. He was actually somewhat immature, so maybe that's, oops, well, he's dead, so it doesn't matter. But staring in this rather staged way at a model of DNA. It's interesting, by the way, that in the same way these continuities, so in the same way that Schrödinger's dad had been a botanist, and he takes up the issue of inheritance from Mendel, Watson was an undergraduate in biology at the University of Chicago. 1 year towards the end of his degree, this is 1946, he reads What is Life? And he says, right, he was going to become an ornithologist. He says, I'm going to become a geneticist. He goes to the University of Indiana to work with Muller and Luria. One Nobel laureate, one soon-to-be Nobel laureate in genetics. Crick was an undergraduate at University College London in physics, and he thought he should become a physicist. So he goes to Cambridge to do a PhD in experimental physics. Actually, he's working on the viscosity of water, and he describes it as outrageously dull. Fortunately, that was interrupted by World War II, and a bomb dropped on the lab, and it destroyed the experiment. And in the meantime, while the lab was being repaired, he read What is Life? And he thought, I want to become a geneticist. And so that's what he did. They met towards the end of 1951, and they published this paper in 1953. This is a Nobel Prize considered one of the most important contributions in science on the fundamental nature of biological memory, and it was written in 2 years. And of course, it led to what was now called the Book of Life, this sort of I mean, it's ridiculous to call this a book of life, but nevertheless, it's the decoding of the human genome that started in 1919. It's finally culminated in 2003. I wanted to show you something kind of beautiful. The same year as Watson and Crick wrote their paper in Nature, Francis Crick wrote to his son, Michael Crick, a letter explaining in detail the structure of the DNA molecule. In fact, it's a better explanation of the molecule than the Nature paper, much better. And at the end, he writes at the end of his letter, we have a letter to Nature in a day or so. Read it carefully so that you understand it. Love, Daddy. and at that moment, Michael Crick knew more about the structure of DNA than anyone else on Earth other than James Watson and Francis. Now, that letter, Michael, it's sort of sentimental, but Michael sold that letter in auction for $6 million a few years ago. Well, you know, what are you going to do? He wanted a first edition of Lord of the Rings. So we talked about the DNA molecule, sort of a memory molecule. It's a bit technical. It's this aperiodic crystal. And the way that people thought that these molecules were read was rather like a book. You just read along the bases, and that turns into proteins that constitute our body. A little bit like reading a poem of Shelley, let's say. But in fact, that's actually not true, and this is where I sort of got interested in it. It's more like a palimpsest. So just to remind you, a palimpsest is a book that is essentially multiple texts. And this comes from a time where the materials that you were writing on were rare and expensive. And so if you found a book that you weren't particularly interested in, and you were lucky enough for it to be on vellum, you could scrape the ink off and put your own poem there in place of the original. And the Archimedes palimpsest is a good example of that, where it's essentially a 10th century vellum manuscript of the 3rd century mathematical speculations of Archimedes of Syracuse, discovered by a bunch of 13th century Christian monks who scraped off the useless mathematics and replaced it with a useful liturgy. Okay? And so that's what it is. And you can see both of these texts if you do X-ray diffraction on it. So you can sort of see it's a beautiful thing where if you have the right technology, you can see that it has all these multiple meanings. And so this is the Watson and Crick. Here's a chromosome that Mendel described. Here is the aperiodic crystal that Schrödinger postulated. And here's the structure that Watson and Crick discovered, and Rosalind Franklin. And this is how they thought it'd be read. It'd be read like this in units of 3. They're the units of the genetic code, ATG, ACG, and each of those corresponds to an amino acid. So here's a picture of that. You just read down it. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But what says what 1 is? Why is it ATG, ACG? Why isn't it TGA? Why can't you just move and start at a different position? This is a commaless system. There's no beginning and end, right? And so, and in fact, there isn't one, and it allows you to do something really remarkable. So I'm going to give you an example from natural language. Imagine you had a series of letters like this, and I'm going to allow you to introduce spaces into those letters, but with the requirement that you generate syntactically and grammatically accurate sentences, but which have a totally different semantics. And in fact, if you try and do this, it's extremely hard, right? So write down a series of letters. You can have as many spaces as you like, and you can introduce them anywhere you like, but the requirement is that you generate meaningful sentences. And it turns out that nature has done this up the wazoo. And so I worked on the mathematics of this problem. I call it genomic compression. And it's a form of compression because what you're trying to do is store a lot of information in a small footprint. So it's exactly like taking a file on your computer and zipping it, or your music files like MP3 files or MPEG files, where you want to have a very small memory footprint, but you want to store all of the relevant information that you can. And it turns out that genomes do this in extraordinary ways, and they do it exactly in an analogous way to the way I introduced 2 meanings into that one sequence of letters. But they do it at an unbelievable level. And so, for example, instead of just having, you could actually have 6 messages being read out of one sequence of nucleotides by just reading them from a different starting position. And this is so remarkable that some not so clever people have suggested that these are actually evidence of intelligent design, right? Because it's so hard to do, and it is hard to do, that they suggested that there's just no way this could have been accomplished unless there was some divine transcendent scribe that had written all of these messages into the genomes. The problem is with this position, I'm not sure that this individual comments on this, is that oh, let me get to this in a second. I'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to point out, just in the spirit of this meeting, that this type of compression of information has been of great interest to musicians. I mean, I'm not speaking of Bach in this case, but actually of Anton Webern. And Webern was fascinated with palindromic structure in music. And actually, this is Webern's tombstone, and it has perhaps the most famous Christian cryptogram, the most famous palindrome in the world, this so-called Sarto Aripo tenet opera rotas. Loosely translated, Aripo the sower holds the wheels at work, which, for those of you with an interest in these kinds of things, occupies billions of blog posts. It's a mystical palindrome. And you can see it can be read. I mean, the point is that you can read it in many, many different ways, right? You can read it this way, this way, this way, this way, and so on. It's like multi-palindromic. What I wanted to say just before was that the ultimate masters of this kind of compression are viruses. So if you're going to say that, they're evidence of divine intervention, well, unfortunately, God's primary interest is in microbes, which, as we know, it might be true. But the extraordinary thing about those kinds of structures, by the way, is that even though you get tons of information in a small space, if you just change one letter, you change multiple meanings. And this is one of the peculiar facts of viruses that you might not know, is that they're the ultimate amnesiacs, because for every 100 viruses that infect you, 99% of them forget they're viruses. Because one little change, what we'd call a mutation, leads them to completely fall apart. And so the only reason why viruses are viable is because there are so many of them. Okay? So that's where I started on getting information into genomes. And I want to shift now, and I'll explain this a little bit autobiographically, to prion proteins. So in the 90s, I was at the University of Oxford. I finished my PhD, and all hell broke loose. And I'm sure many of you remember this. I was right in the middle of it. There was the outbreak of so-called mad cow disease. And it was discovered that the reason why this was happening is because we were taking sick cows, we were basically blowing them to pieces and feeding them back to healthy cows. And so cannibalism, right, in cows was essentially responsible for the growth of the number of, essentially the concentration of infected tissues. And no one quite knew how significant a threat this would be for the human population. The government at the time said it was no threat at all. And so this is a nice cartoon where they compare the sort of cuts of beef to the risk associated with eating beef. And you can't actually see that there, but that in there says actual threat. So it's a micro cut, right? Most of it's just neurosis, right? And the agricultural minister at the time, John Gummer, thought that the way he would convince the public that this was no threat is going to eat a hamburger on television. But the guy was so stupid, he had his daughter eat the hamburger too. He thought this would be a way of convincing people how safe it was, but in the end it just made him look completely heartless. Because he thought, if you want to kill yourself, not a problem. But why are you killing your daughter too, right? Because of course we didn't know at the time. Just a fairly typical Tory behavior. But this is the underlying cause of the anxiety. And this actually is interesting prequel to now our concerns with Ebola virus, right? Because this is the growth of the number of cases reported in Europe, in Western Europe, and who knows where it was going, right? I mean, if you looked at the early Ebola, I remember looking at those plots and thinking, God, that's exponentiating. We haven't got anywhere near the saturation point. And it was the same logic here. Maybe this was going to continue and we were all going to die of hamburger disease. The reason why people were terrified is because there was actually a precedent. And the precedent came from a small tribe in New Guinea known as the Foray tribe. And the Foray tribe in the 1950s had an outbreak of a neurodegenerative disease called Kuru. Kuru is actually a Foray word. It means laughter, because in the acute phase of this disease, it's very often the case that the neurodegeneration leads to a state of disinhibition where individuals would laugh just as they fell over. And the characteristic tissue pathology associated with Kuru was these big vacuoles in the nervous system. Okay? And so this had been studied at length in the 1950s, and it had been discovered that the primary cause of infection was cannibalism. So you can see the sort of interest. It wasn't cannibalism in cows, it was cannibalism in humans. And this was a big debate, by the way, in ethnography about whether or not this really was cannibalism or something else, because is this an acceptable thing to say in relation to another group of human beings. And you can't see these plots. Forget the top one. But one thing you notice is that the primary group that was susceptible to this disease was men and women. Women and young children, I'm sorry. So what do we know now? Well, we know that this is a group that practices mortuary cannibalism, ritual cannibalism. That is that there is a belief in the life cycle of the flesh, the release of the spirit, and that when individuals were dying, a few selected bodies were taken down from the canopies of the trees and fed upon. And the men in the population were eating muscle, and the women and children were eating nervous system and offal. And the prion protein is concentrated in neural tissues. And so that's where it started. And once this was understood, and this practice it was advised that the practice be diminished, then the incidence of the disease dropped. So why am I telling you all of this? Because there was a suggestion that the fundamental mechanism by which this was transmitted was unlike any other transmission mechanism that we knew. It wasn't DNA-based. It wasn't a memory system based on nucleic acids at all. It was something fundamentally new and different that was named by Stanley Prusner a proteinaceous infectious particle, a prion. This is very, very profound, by the way, because if it were true, it would be an absolute revolution in our understanding of heredity. Because from Mendel down, it was always assumed that the only way you could get some form of transmission or heredity was through nucleic acids. And Stan Prusner, who first proposed this, or sort of first proposed it, was ostracized for decades for suggesting this. But finally, in 1997, the evidence was compelling enough, but not definitive, by the way, for him to be awarded the Nobel Prize for this suggestion. And you can't see it here, but there is the canonical mode, which is DNA-based, and the heretical memory system, which is there's no DNA at all. And it really was considered a heresy. And so there were a series of papers suggesting how this all got transmitted by structure. So it was very interesting. Instead of being template-based propagation, sequences of nucleotides, it was structure-based. In fact, what was being propagated was form itself. And at that point, I got extremely excited. And so I thought, right, if that's true, and this is a totally alternative form of transmission in the natural world, I want to know what its evolution is, and I want to understand how it works. So in the sort of words of Quentin Tarantino, I went medieval on its ass and sort of published a whole series of papers trying to understand what's going on. And this was an interesting turning point in my career because no one really gave a damn. And it was an interesting case where, like high-energy physics, the theory just ran away from the data. There just wasn't enough good data. And even to this day, by the way, we don't really know whether Prusner's right. And so at this point, I became somewhat despondent. You can escape, and wasn't sure quite what to do. And here, I want to explain why it's so wonderful being at a university that has a diversity of minds. I was sort of my own boss. I had a fellowship. I didn't really work for anybody. And so I'd spend my days wandering around the Oxford campus thinking what I wanted to work on next. And I was extremely fortunate because I went to the classes of these two individuals. I started going to Isaiah Berlin's very small discussion groups on the nature of history, and Peter at PMS Hacker's small workshops on the nature of Wittgenstein. He was actually translating Wittgenstein, involved in a new translation at the time. And I got to sit in these groups. There were like 6 of us. And, you get to sit down with Isaiah Berlin, every week and talk about history. It doesn't happen very often. In fact, I have a funny story. I took a friend of mine to one of these discussions at All Souls, was where Berlin was. And we were having a conversation, and I nudged him and he said, "You do realize who that is?" He's a great hero of mine. And he said, well, no. I said, well, that's Isaiah Berlin. And he said, no, he isn't. I said, well, of course it is. And he said, no, he isn't. And on the wall that we were in was a huge portrait of Isaiah Berlin, you know. I said, who's that then? You know, so anyway. So, but it was really Hacker who had the greatest influence, because we started reading very carefully Wittgenstein's last work, The Philosophical Investigations, where he thinks very carefully about language games. And just to sort of horribly trivialize it, essentially this notion that language is like a game of chess, that has a set of rules, and there's an engagement and a series of exchanges. And I got very interested. I said, well, if that's true, and I had worked a lot on the mathematics of game theory, why don't I do Wittgenstein game theoretically? Why can't we mathematize what he said in the Philosophical Investigations? So at the time I was working with, oh yes, so that's the book. There's lots of nice, you know, the very famous paradox and duck umbrella and all that. I was working with this guy. This was at the time, this is Martin Novak. He was a professor of mathematical biology at Oxford. Looks a bit like him, doesn't he, I think? And that's on a good day. That's on a good day. And we used to take afternoon walks, and I said to Martin, look, I'm done. I'm done with this prion stuff. It's very political. I mean, it's another story, maybe over drinks. We got in lots of trouble with the government. It was considered irresponsible because perhaps we were jeopardizing the economy, and what about the farmers and all that. And so I said, why don't we work on language games? And at the time, Martin said, perfect timing, because he was sick of Oxford too, and he'd been just offered a new position to run a new center, a new institute at the Institute for Advanced Study. And for many, many years in Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study had been interested in mathematical biology. They're very famous for their mathematical physics. And Oppenheimer was one of the very early proponents of a program in mathematical biology, but the physicists didn't like it, and Freeman Dyson revived it. And so because of Freeman, Martin was asked to come and run that new institute, and he took me with him. And so we went to Princeton in 1999, and we met medieval on the ass of mathematics. I'm not sure this can be edited out, of the evolution of language, trying to apply game theory to this kind of language game concept. And that is my bridge to the work that I've been doing with Dan. And so that made me aware, in some sense, that it was possible to apply some of the methods that we have been developing, the frameworks, to cultural objects. That there wasn't a divide, that it was perfectly reasonable. And if you had the right collaborators and reasonable questions, you could make some contribution to this debate. And so that's part 2 now, on something closer, I think, to the interest of this group. But I just wanted to explain it to you, give you a sense of how these things actually serendipitously play out. So the thing I got very interested in was the novel. Because, you know, I'd been interested in these units, these replicating units. They were prion proteins or they were genes. You know, what is this thing that we call a novel? What is a book? I mean, what is it, right? So you could say, well, you know, a non-fiction book, you say, well, it's some kind of concentrated distillation of insights and facts, so a history. It's both fact and interpretation in one object somehow that's brought to life when you interact with it. And what's a novel, though? It's a kind of counterfactual history. It's a facts that never happened. I mean, and so I started pursuing this, and you look at Tolstoy, and if you remember at the end of War and Peace, he has that long essay, which a lot of people don't like, but I quite like, actually, on history. Isaiah Berlin liked it, so I like it. And so I'm very derivative of my thinking. And, he said, I didn't clarify anything. He said, what is it? It's not a novel, it's not an epic. What is it? And he doesn't actually answer it. So I went to the other great Russian interpreter of the novel, and that's Bakhtin. And Bakhtin had this idea of what he called a chronotope, hence the title of this talk. And here's what Bakhtin says a chronotope is. I'll read this. We will give the name chronotope, literally time-space, to the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature. This term, space-time, is employed in mathematics and was introduced as part of Einstein's theory of relativity. The special meaning it has in relativity theory is not important for our purposes. We are borrowing it for literary criticism almost as a metaphor almost but not entirely. And I'm interested in the extent of the not entirely. And this comes from his essay, Form of Time and the Chronotope in the Novel. And he spends most of his time on Rabelais. So, okay, Dan, there you go. Look how handsome he looks. And, you know, I always think with the collaborators, my collaborators always look like slightly less handsome, famous actors. Don't you think? Yeah. Come on. And you've been consulted on that show. So, okay, let's take this seriously. How can we do some kind of principled space-time analysis of novel form? And as I say, oops, I'm running out of batteries. I want to talk a little bit about a prequel. So this is Vera and Vladimir Nabokov, hunting. This is how intellectuals hunt. And in 1950s, in 51 and 52, he was a professor at Harvard, and he gave a series of lectures on Don Quixote. And it's a really marvelous book. It's a typically anally retentive Nabokovian book. If you've looked at his translations of Pushkin, you know what I'm talking about. And he's very specific about how things are done. He's an extremely detail-oriented individual. And Joseph Wood Crutch, who is a professor of literature at Columbia University, who'd written a biography of Thoreau, made a point that really irritated Nabokov. And he said that, you know, Don Quixote is always defeated in his battles. He's kind of pathetic, tragic, comedic hero who never really comes through, and he's the butt of all sorts of jokes and is endlessly mocked. And so he actually did the first quantitative analysis, one of the first, and I stand corrected on this, of novel form, in a very interesting way. And what he did is he went through the book, and he starts at this point here, and he says, every time Don Quixote wins a battle, I add one, and every time he loses a battle, I subtract one, right? Now, if he always loses, that should just go down and down and down and down to zero. But no, but he gets this beautiful little landscape, and it actually gives you a visual representation of the kind of structure of the novel that you wouldn't be able to see immediately if you were reading it, because you get lost in the details. So it's an interesting, macroscopic, very simple representation of plot structure. And he concludes, so the final score is 20-20, or in the terms of tennis, 6-3, 3-6, 6-4, 5-7, but the fifth set will never be played. Death cancels the match. I said, okay. So that was rather nice. And as you know, I mean, he was fascinated in exactly this kind of thing. I mean, this is his annotations of Kafka's Metamorphosis that he insisted on calling the Transformation. He couldn't stand that name for various interesting taxonomical reasons, which we could discuss. And this is his drawing of James Joyce's Ulysses, the map structure of Ulysses. So it's an interesting way of reading, and it's very close to, I think, what is meant by the chronotype and chronotope. And I'm now going to give you, really, it's just a version of this, but with a little bit more maths and computation thrown in, but not in some senses less deep. So, you know, we recognize, as Dan pointed out at the beginning, you know, there's a huge amount of material for us to analyze now online. I mean, it's available. Many novels have been digitized, if not all of them. Not all of them are available. You can ask Jeff Bezos to liberate them, or maybe not. And so we looked at about just under 8,000 books, and what we did something horrendous to them. We put them in a particle accelerator and blew them to bits, okay? And we blew them into their constituent words. It's an extraordinarily simple-minded thing to do. And in particular, we were only interested in function words, no nouns, very few verbs, so that we wouldn't really have any insights into what they were writing about. Just in some sense, words relating to style, to the way in which sentences are constructed, just by virtue of the frequencies of thuses and therebys and so forth. Okay? And then every book is just then a list of the number of times particular words appear. So we know nothing about the subject. This is very, very reductive. And why do we pursue this line of research? It's been known for a long time, and this is something that Dan had worked on, that in terms of classification, it's quite useful just to look at frequencies. So it had been known that if you were interested in establishing whether a work had been written by Shakespeare or not, you didn't really have to look that carefully at all the plot elements, the complex semantic stylometry. It was often sufficient to just look at the frequency of words. So it doesn't give you a great understanding of what's being said, but it allows you to make discriminations between Shakespeare and not Shakespeare. So that's the spirit of this horrible atomization of a novel. And once you've got that, you can do a little bit of maths, because we like things like vectors and matrices, and we could measure distances between books just by how different they were with respect to the number of times they used a set of so many hundred words. Very simple. And then with that, you can construct a network. And the network here, each of these nodes is a book, and they are connected when they share above some statistically significant threshold number of these words. So that's a graph or a network, according to which you prefer. And one thing that was extremely interesting about this network is, even though we had never allowed the subject matter to appear in our analysis, it was utterly trivial, we started to find these weird little groupings. So it turns out that Civil War generals use the words and, of, whereby, and thus very similarly, right? And similarly for a little constellation of natural historians, which is very, very weird when you think about it from the point of view of influence and heredity. I mean, you could imagine I like Darwin, so I'd write about finches, but you wouldn't think that I like Darwin, so I'm going to write like him with respect to the number of times I use the word whereby. I mean, this was a shock to us. But most of the structure in this graph comes from time. So if you like, this is a chronotope-like structure, but at the level of many novels. The space dimension is the words that are used, and there's a time dimension because there's a timestamp on the publication of these books. And it turns out that most of that structure is time. You're more like individuals who publish in the same period as you. And we did various kinds of analyses, and not surprisingly, the further you are apart in time, the less similar you are. So in terms of the way you use words, you're more similar to your exact contemporaries. Big surprise. Of greater interest, though, is the rate at which that curve decays. And that is a function of time itself. And I'll just summarize that by saying that as you move into the future, the same interval of 10 years of time corresponds to a smaller and smaller distance between books. And so we suggested that, in fact, soon novels will only be influenced by their exact contemporaries. And the idea is actually, the logic of this is quite simple. If you only have so much time to read, but you're reading at a time when there are only 1 or 10 books published per year, that's not a problem, right? Whereas if you're reading at a time when there are hundreds of thousands of books published per year, what are you going to do? And this is this experience that we all have, right? If you go into a library of the 18th or 19th century, you recognize all the authors. But if you go to your friend's library, you think, well, who are they? It's like going to your friend's music collection. It's like, well, I don't know. What planet do you come from? And so the point here is that, a little bit like relativity, at high velocities, which is what's happening now, space and time contract. So I want you to, this is the culmination of that point that Bakhtin said, that maybe this relativistic concept is more than just an analogy, and it is more than an analogy, because at the high velocity of information transmission, space and time contract, such that now we're all living at one point of identity. And we wrote this up in a paper, and all hell broke loose, right? I mean, it was like written up in all sorts of newspapers, and people saying, are literary classics obsolete, and the influence of classic literature on writers declining, study claims. And I have to say, I thought, well, yes, yes, we know that. And in fact, I was amazed that they were surprised. Here's a plot from, this goes from, I think it goes, yes, 2005 to 2010. It looks at the percentage change in our habits. So watching TV, this is not even now, right? This is 2010. 5% increase TV, 121% increase in watching the internet. Now, this is a zero-sum game, right? You have finite time. One's going up, one's going down. Listening to the radio, not online. Reading newspapers and books don't even feature here. They're not even a blip. So we know that already. So I was never quite sure why it was that people were so offended by the remark, because we know it's true. We just put a little bit of mathematics to that observation. We have finite time, we're overwhelmed, we're selective in what we read, and we tend to read our contemporaries. Unless you're a literary scholar, in which case you don't, but that's a privilege. So now I want to shift to another project, which is an ongoing project that we're working on. And I don't know if have you talked about this sort of stuff yet? Which is on another kind of book, Constitutions. This is a painting of the first signing of the US Constitution of 1788, which is really, in some sense, the original Constitution in the modern era. And what are these things? What are they? What are constitutions? Well, they're sort of the rules that govern us. They have to be interpreted. But they provide a whole series of insights into notions of sovereignty, the separation of powers, what to do in a state of emergency, how we should deal with human rights, what the preferred economic system should be, and so forth. And there are many different kinds of constitutions, and we're working here with a constitutional historian at the University of Chicago, Tom Ginsberg, who sort of keeps us on track. And it's very interesting, that interaction between what we do and what Tom does. And how does this work? I want to explain what we did with the constitutions. It's slightly less crude than what, this was 100 constitutions that we had in digital form, going back to the original US Constitution of 1788. And we're doing something called topic modeling, and I'm sure many of you know, because it's one of those preferred methods of digital humanities. But I'm just, for those who don't, I'll explain it to you in a pictorial form. Imagine that you had a whole series of New York Times newspapers. What you do is you do a little bit of mathematics, which allowed you to break all of those papers down into, it's funny, this is quite a low-resolution projector. It is, yeah. It would, into what are called topics. And so topics are constellations of related words that typically have a thematic similarity. So, for example, a topic might be economic issues that the paper is covering, or it might be entertainment or film or the book review section, more or less roughly corresponding to the sections of the newspaper. And the idea is that once you've done this in a kind of totally machine-driven way, any newspaper can be constructed just by sort of adding together, at the level of topics, some set of topics from your total set that you've derived from the entire history of newspapers. So if I gave you a copy of the New York Times, you could say, that's dominated by topic 1, 14, 29, 36, and 45. That's the sort of insight. Again, it's very crude. It's not as crude as bags of words, but it's almost as crude. And then you do something a bit cleverer, is you construct what's called a diffusion tree. You say, I can order these newspapers in time, and I'm going to say a newspaper has an ancestral newspaper if it takes some certain number of topics from that ancestral newspaper, and of course it takes information from the world. After all, they're newspapers. Okay? So this is a metaphor. We're not doing it on newspapers. We're doing it on constitutions, which really do borrow from each other. So when a new nation is formed, or when a nation makes a transition between different states of governance, for example, becomes a democratic state, they write a constitution. And how do you do that? You don't sit down and you go into a cafe and say, okay, what do we need to do? Let's see. What do we need? Well, you go to a constitution that is congenial to you, that you feel is relevant to your circumstances, and you basically borrow it, copy and paste. That's how constitutions are really written. Now what we have, so I've shown it through the New York Times because it'll be a little simpler, is each of these points now then is a constitution. And constitutions are connected by this sort of diffusion approach if they share some threshold number of topics. And now you might want to know something a little bit deeper, which is, how are constitutions different and similar? Are there groups of constitutions that are similar? And so one way in which you can do that is through something called looking at the community structure of a graph. And that simply says that, if you look at it, it's pretty obvious. You can't really see it because of the low-resolution projector, but there are actually a few edges that connect these clusters. And these are constitutions that have a lot in common with each other, but not so much across communities. And if you do that, you can reconstruct things that look like this. And this is taking all of the constitutions that we have in our data set, about 99 of them, and it's finding 3 separate historical communities. It turns out we were kind of surprised, and these correspond to eras in the writing of constitutions. Okay? So era 1, 1787 to 1970, 71 to 90, and 91 to 2008. Now, this is not something that would be easy to do if you were a constitutional historian, but it's something useful to be given, and then to reflect on it and try and decide whether it has legitimacy or not. And so this is how we work with Tom. Look, this is what we find, Tom. Rubbish. You know, oh, that's interesting. Okay. And we can go further down. We can do some microanalysis. This is kind of cool. So I think it's called When Mendel Meets Montesquieu. So every constitution, as I've told you by that diffusion tree, has some number of parents. So here's a target constitution. It has 2 parent constitutions. So these are the ones with which it shares a significant number of topics. And it will have offspring. That is, constitutions that borrow from it. So this is one that has 2 parents and 2 kids. This is the kind of bourgeois model. Here's a more interesting one. Here's a case of a sort of a constitution that only borrowed from one parent, an asexual parent, but then contributed to 3 constitutional offspring. And you can play with all sorts of these. This is one that's infertile. Here's a constitution that borrowed widely, but contributed nothing. And you can do this for all the constitutions. I'm not sure this is going to show up, but it's kind of cool. You get this zoo where you can't see it, but every constitution has a characteristic constitutional motif. Right? And we find a whole zoo of them that are really extraordinary. And this is, I'm worried now. Yeah, this is what I'm worried about. This is a problem. Oops. And so what you can do is you can take those little micromotifs that tell you how many parents each constitution has and how many offspring, break that back down. And so now this is time in years, and this is the number of parents. So here's the United States of America. It has no parents, but it has descendants. Well, actually, there's no written parents. There is a big debate about the so-called oral constitution of the Iroquois, and that's interesting in itself. Yes, but so we exclude it from our analysis because we only have 99 constitutions. But it's absolutely true that there are things. So this is where defer to Tom moment, right? Where we would say what should be in our data set, and you could go back to ancient Sumer. Indeed. Right, and so that's a good point. So here we start with, that's the one we start with, and what we're looking at is in time. You'll see an interesting pattern here. Not surprisingly, given where we started in time, is that as we move along in time, these constitutions have more and more parents, because of course France has a parent that's the United States, and so on. Okay, but you'll see that this actually saturates at some point. I'm going to get to that in a second. This is the number of offspring. So this is a weird result. So the number of offspring is roughly invariant in time. And so what we find is essentially by 1940, the number of parents that constitutions have is more or less a constant at 8. There's a big spread, a lot of variance, but the mean. Whereas the number of offspring is more or less 8 throughout time, this recorded time. Okay? So now you can ask an interesting question. This baseline gives us a baseline for comparison. We can say, what does it mean to be above it? It's a measure of success, if you like. And what does it mean to be below it? So here's the idea. It's a kind of notion of constitutional influence. If you have an above mean number of offspring, loads of people copy you in this data set, subject to the caveats that you guys point out. But you have a below mean number of parents, you're extraordinarily innovative. That means that what you've done cannot be ascribed to what came before you in the data, right? And a lot of people think what you've done is worthwhile. That's what I'd call an innovative constitution. A derivative constitution is a case where you have no one wants to, or very few individuals, constitutions want to imitate you, but you have tons of individuals that you copy. By definition, that's derivative, right? Representative constitutions are ones where you assimilate a huge amount of information that others consider valuable, and then they get that information by emulating you. And I couldn't come up with a better word here. This was a kind of weird case, which is rather sad. And I just, I don't know, it's like a foundering constitution. It's kind of a runt. It just doesn't do anything, really. And you can look at them. I hate to single out Austria, but it is, it is, by this measure, not very interesting. Brazil, on the other hand, not surprisingly, is very interesting. And the reason for this, of course, is that it's this kind of portal into South America. because it assimilates, it assimilates information that's of value to the particular geopolitical circumstances that it has and it faces, and it's widely emulated by other burgeoning democracies. Egypt is an interesting Middle Eastern representative constitution because in that sense that it integrates widely, but it's also emulated widely. So that's the kind of thing that you can do quantitatively and then go back to the historian and say, this is, we're suggesting is this true? Is this met the other bodies of data that would either utterly reject this form of analysis, or perhaps it's stimulating and there's a new way of thinking about the data. So, okay, so let me just get to the very end. So I give you a sense of this two sets of projects, the biological and the cultural. They all have at their core this interest in what I mentioned at the beginning, which is memory, issues of fidelity, issues of the units of transmission and so on, and the capacity. So I want to just get to a sort of slightly bleak coda. And this relates to my abstract. There was a time, and this is hard to imagine, where there were no ready sources of information. I mean, it's hard to imagine this, actually. But if you had an argument, you just go on forever because there was no authority. You couldn't say, look in the encyclopedia, right, or ask X. I mean, so now we resolve all disputes by just, I'm looking it up on Google, or Wikipedia, or the Encyclopedia Britannica, or, Brockhauser, or whatever your favorite encyclopedia is. But this is information that we all have ready to hand, more or less, and we're accustomed to it. There was a time when there was nothing like that. So what happened? So in the 16th century, and actually goes back to antiquity, in this beautiful book by Dame Frances Yates on this called The Art of Memory. Well, you had to memorize it all. Individuals had to memorize vast amount of information about, say, for example, the classical texts that would become authorities. And so the great self-help books of the 16th and 17th centuries were memory treatises. It was much more important than why am I not having a good relationship, or, right? I mean, the important thing there was, I can't remember anything, How am I going to do this? And so a whole series of very elaborate schemes were created, basically based on this idea that was finally distilled by Peter Ravenna in a book called The Phoenix, which was called the memory loci. And it's very counterintuitive. We can discuss it perhaps later if anyone's interested, which is essentially that the way you remember things is by placing them in positions in space with which you are familiar. You think it's making it harder because you're not only having to remember the thing, but the cathedral, but it turns out it makes it easier because you're using your somatosensory system to assist your frontal cortex. So you get this huge assist from something that's very powerful in terms of other memory systems. And that's the basic principle, is that, this is Camillo's theatre of memory. In fact, Francis I of France built such a thing. And the idea was that you imagine this giant stadium, and in each seat in the stadium you play a particular work, and somehow that helps you to remember it, and particularly the relationships between the works. And of course, the great theorist of memory systems was Giordano Bruno, and he was remembered for other things. But actually in this book, The Shadow of Ideas really sets forth in detail how to develop a mnemotechnics, that is, a technology of memory systems. And I want to emphasize this because I think memory is a much more active thing than we typically ascribe to it. In other words, it's not just a passive repository of facts, right? It's an active, dynamical, associative and inferential device. And if you don't have anything in your memory, I don't think you can think, right? But there's a sort of move, unfortunately. But to this, and I'm not singling you out, because I know you're taking notes. You're not looking. But they're kind of memory, outsourced memory. But there is really, I think, a dilemma, and I think, I think there is something to committing poems to memory that allows you to think about them in deeper ways than just reading them on the page. And I think that's true for everything, by the way. I think it's very true for mathematics, right? And I think it's true for any inferential, rigorous, formal system. And I worry that we're losing our intelligence by virtue of losing our memory. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Yes.
I was fascinated by the study of constitutions, and I wonder, you used topic modeling to the study. How did that survive multilingualism, or did you solve that by translating them all into a common language? Or
these are all in one language. It's quite crude, and
it's a big database.
Yeah.
The Comparative Constitutions Project that Tom and Zach Elkins managed, and they're all in English.
But it is a good point, and if you did this, you would have to have, because of course what you need to do is these topics sort of need to be labeled, as you know, right? And so you would need an expert in any given language to label them.
Well, in particular, if what you're studying is the kind of intentions that the Constitution writers had, and what were they actually reading, as opposed to what echoes, or intentional or unintentionally, you might find yourself skipping an intermediate or interpolating an intermediate where there wasn't one or something.
No, and that's a really interesting point. That's absolutely right, because these algorithms will skip a generation, right? In other words, if I can go straight back, and there are many constitutions which only go back, they're kind of originalist, right, in the sense that they'll only go back to the US Constitution, they'll skip everything in between, because everything's there, it's an easier borrow. But it's not clear that's what they really did, and it's a weakness of the statistics.
So, I'm sure you're familiar with Borges's library.
Of course, yeah.
The library of Babel, where the books are a certain length, each page has a certain number of characters, and within that library is contained all the possible permutations of language, with those formal constraints. I was listening to your constitutional example and thinking of the talk of constitution in Plato's time and all this and throughout history, and thinking about how actually repetition does not work in an symplastic way. Symplastic as in trying to conform to one container as opposed to a gene sequence. One way to visualize what I'm trying to say is to imagine a sort of network of texts that are separated from each other only by a letter-time distance, in which one text is here, and then one text with one small differences here, and then another one with two differences here, and so on, in n dimensions, of course, because of the different amount of characters. And it is within that sort of rhizomatic structure that one can imagine repetition in a way that would trouble these sort of hierarchical models that you've constructed. And I wonder if you thought about these sort of troubling topological spaces.
Well, that's what we do, of course, is think about those topological spaces, and so quite a lot. And there is a result in phylogenetic reconstruction which suffers. This problem goes away in higher dimensions. Wow. So there is something called long branch attraction. This is the canonical example in phylogeny, right? Which is that if you have a very small number of character states, right, that you can actually stick things together because you think they're similar for the wrong reason. They can be similar by chance when the number of character states is low. That's the problem. And so you have to be very aware of your thresholding criterion. In fact, this is what we spend most of the time discussing. Are these things connected or not? And what is the appropriate way of thinking about it? But your objection is absolutely spot on, I think. And it's the hardest thing to do in this work, is to decide, is this what we would say, significantly above the appropriate null distance in the appropriate geometry? Right, and it's not answered. I mean, it's actually somewhat subjective, that debate.
Okay, well, I'm going to present this in a slightly adversarial form.
That's good.
I don't know that and I think it builds on the last two comments.
Yeah.
It seems like in both the chronotope project and in the constitutions project, both with the measure of function words and with the topic modeling, what you're doing is measuring similarity and then making claims about influence. And that claims about influence, they have to be causal claims. But similarity doesn't tell us anything about causality. For example, penguins and tuxedos are similar.
They're not causal claims. They're not causal.
To say that influence is a causal claim, transmission is a causal claim, diffusion is a causal claim.
Well, they're not actually. So let me I'll clarify that.
Right,
so this is. Well, no, because remember what the methods are doing. You're right to make this point. So that the methods that we use establish connection just based on similarity. The only sense in which there's anything even sort of remotely causal is the fact that we lay these things out in time. So a violation of temporal causality would be to say, your constitution borrows from a constitution that was not yet written. So we impose a chronological constraint on our diffusion trees by ordering them in time. That's about as causal as we get. And then, of course, as I said, you go to the constitutional historian and you say, do you have additional supplementary evidence to suggest that this is likely to have happened? So the way you should think about this is they're hypotheses of influence. That's what they are, they're hypotheses. But to prove them requires another level of analysis that exceeds what we've done. So I don't know if that helps, but... Yes?
Along the same lines, I was gratified when you showed the three clusters.
Oh, the eras.
Three clusters there.
Yeah.
And then you said, then we take this to Tom. And,
Yeah.
and then because, the public misconstrues what big data does in science.
Yeah.
The public believes that big data answers questions.
Yeah.
And what you're showing us is that it has the power to raise questions that then require further analysis.
Yes.
It's almost as if what you're doing is using the power of computation to detect patterns.
Generate as well.
Really,
Yes.
and some of the patterns have meaning and some of the patterns may not.
Yes.
In order to determine which do, you need then to look at the conversations underlying those patterns. And that's what your constitutional historian will do, and determine what are conversations and what are not conversations, and the shape of these conversations. Because, just repetition is, in an absolute sense, never happens.
Mm-hmm.
Every repetition is another layer of meaning in another sense. And conversation, it complicates that even further, because if one constitutional scholar is talking to another constitutional scholar, or one state that's writing a constitution is talking to another one, the meanings are constantly in shift. So I love the fact that competition can raise issues for us. Why is it that the public misconstrues the power of data to answer questions rather than to raise them?
But why not just stop at public misconstrues? I would have been more than happy to stop.
Social science, I think, bears
Yes.
some of the,
Yeah.
some of the
Well, I think so. Well, right. No, so obviously I agree with you. I would add, though, just a few things, and I don't, your colleague's question also, which is that it also raises, Tom will look at data and say, well, I hadn't thought that way, but I didn't realize. So it's not purely, we're not interested in necessarily finding a new fancy form that would reaffirm all of Tom's prior beliefs. That would not be useful for us. And so somehow it's something in the middle that's somewhat interesting, right? That challenges what he thought, but also is compatible with that micro-analysis that you're describing. I never thought of that before. In fact, that's happened a few times, exactly that. Okay, with respect to the public, this is a source of despair for me, because my view is that, just so you know where I come from in this, is that, so I'm trained in natural sciences, right? So I believe in the experiment, right? And I think that a lot of the computational approach does actually struggle with the correlational causal problem very deeply, and it's not resolving it. And I think big literature on this, and so there's the kind of statistical approach to causality typically associated with Pearl and Judea Pearl, and now the more fancy version called essentially causal information flow, something we also work on. It's an attempt to do it without the experiment, or you go in and you say, as you said with Tom or the lab, and you say, well, that's suggestive, let's now do the experiment. The thing about that stuff is it takes time, it takes expertise, it's nuanced. Drawing a picture that the New York Times can replicate is relatively quick. And so I think part of this has to do with the fact that we're such visual species, and we're so responsive to schematic visual representations of data, even when those things aren't actually telling you as much as you think they are. It's a kind of pathology of our brain, actually. But in terms of public understanding, it gets to my opening remarks about beauty and difficulty. I think that is something that has to be learnt. That there are, it's like a cup of coffee. It starts off tasting acrid and horrid, and then you become addicted to it, like good single malt whiskey. And I think ideas are like that. They're like single malt whiskey. Yeah, no, right? And it takes time to appreciate them, and there isn't a royal road to that kind of insight, and that's why we're here. Yeah.
So I want to ask you about that pathology you
Yeah.
just mentioned. I mean, it strikes me that you showed us again and again that memory does not work like linear text that can be neatly parsed into semantic units. And you not only gave us countless examples, but you showed us by saying, hey, remember who Mendel was by looking at this beautiful portrait of Mendel.
Yeah.
So why all this attention to parsing texts as opposed to images?
Well, it's easier. I mean, I hate to be. That's the answer. It's the answer. You're absolutely right. It's just so much harder. And I mean, Dan has worked on it. I don't know if you want to reply to that, but I think that's basically.
No, I mean, that's the, more or less people agree on the units. I mean, you might not agree on what the molecules are, but more or less people agree on the atoms, when it comes to text or phonemes or something. But text is easier, and when it comes to images, it's just not at all clear what the quote-unquote dimension reduction is supposed to be. I mean, you get some information from working just on pixels, but not a lot. And so then once you say not a lot, you've got so many different things, so many different ways to try to represent an image, and and then even the images depend on how the images are captured. So there are just so many more variables. But I would say that some of the most interesting questions in these kinds of big data approaches to culture, quote unquote culturomics, they're great questions to ask about images, and they're just difficult. Even in analogizing any of the work that's been done in text, and some of the very simple stuff has been done, is a great challenge and a great problem.
Yeah,
that's Humanities has done some of that work. His work on Mark Rothko in particular.
Yeah, but it's pretty. It's pretty crude. We look at color or something like that. I mean, what was heartening to me is, I think the guys who could figure out, you could start this sequence in any number of one places, ought to be able to figure out the pixel thing. I mean, I'm counting on you.
Well, it's oddly enough, it's easier. It's a much easier problem. I don't know how to. But I think you know. Yes,
Hi, I'm a scholar of medical citation, and I've often wanted to apply these kind of techniques to my work. The problem that I have that I would like to know if you have a way out of, it's a kind of catch-22 situation in that a scholar called Paul Dumthor had a kind of pessimism about how we approach medical texts, and that we are so far removed from them that we can't ever really appreciate them culturally. And I look at it by thinking, well, maybe if I study citation and I study how these texts interlink, then maybe that's a way to get my head into that cultural space. But of course, I'm always making interpretations based on my own assumptions and based on these kind of connections that you're seeing, where you see similarities, but we don't know, is this a real similarity, or is this just a nice pattern that's occurred? And the thing that strikes me is even when there's external evidence, particularly when you're at sort of a distance of cultural remove, that cultural evidence itself, the external evidence itself can be subject to that same kind of cycle. And I often worry about, well, how do I get on or off this roundabout, this catch-22 situation? I wonder if you have any thoughts about how you deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, it not well. And so so I'll give you an example of something a little bit in the nature of that case. So once we could do tree reconstructions, phylogenies, we threw them at all data, including data of microbial life. But it was realized by people like Carl Woese, University of Illinois, very early, that early life, microbial life, doesn't behave like large multicellular eukaryotic life. It's constantly sharing information, something called horizontal gene transfer. So the direct acyclic graph, the tree structure of a parent-offspring relationship, is not the right structure for the data. It's a network. And that was, I just give that as an example, because it was us imposing, because we had algorithms that could do tree reconstruction, and we had sequence data, we said, well, I can reconstruct the trees of microbial life. It's wrong. The underlying mechanism violates, if you like, the assumptions of the reconstruction algorithm. So that's a case which I know of, and it took kind of honesty and an awareness, and going back to the drawing board and saying, okay, we have to do this again. So that's one thing. On the other hand, the positive side, it has to do with how comfortable you are, and it gets to this point with uncertainty. And I think this is actually something that science, not the popular conception of science, but science as it's practiced. Because you have to remember, as I said, Heisenberg was 19. He won a Nobel Prize by telling all of his professors that they were wrong and he was right. And he was right, okay, provisionally right. And I think this idea that everything is there to be challenged, everything, and replaced, and that all remarks are provisional, but slightly less provisional, hopefully, with time. But then it's okay. And I think that if you consider your remarks apodictic, if you're going to say this is a definitive statement on that, but I think the way we do it, the way we deal with this is by, in some sense with statistics, we sort of say, I can assign a probability, if it's a simple system, to my certainty. And that, I think that is the right approach to the... So you're struggling with this problem, and you say, well, this is just one set of possibilities, and I ascribe a certain certainty to it. But that's the best I can do. And I think the problem is if you think that you can know, and then you're kind of screwed. Oh, sorry. Sorry. But you can ask me as we walk. I see you. Yes, sorry.
So I really, really enjoyed the talk immensely. And I'm very sympathetic to everything you're doing here. And it's important that I say that for what I'm going to say next.
Oh, no! I like that. And you did that in such a way that you oriented your right shoulder towards me in a sort of an aggressive way.
Yeah, well, it's a good provocation, let's say. And the provocation is this. I'm skeptical about many of the claims you made. And it's not about the techniques, which I said I'm on board with. Like, all these things, yes, they are things I've done and spent a lot of time thinking about. Why I'm skeptical is because of the corpora that you're using. And the ways in which you're trying to, first of all, I don't know anything about the corpora you did for any of these things. And I would argue that is incredibly important. And let me give you just a few examples to sort of like contextualize what I mean. Because I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm saying I just have no idea until you show me the corpora. And so a few things. So for instance, like if you take the constitutions, presumably some of them are written in different languages. Maybe not. I don't know. I don't know anything about constitutions, but presumably some of them are written in different languages. If your move is to say, I'm just going to use Google translate all these things to English, what you're actually going to find is you're getting an authorial statistical style signal from Google Translate. Now, of course, you may know this. I'm just saying these as like possible examples. Again, know nothing about, right? Just to give you some context for what I'm talking about. Another thing, like this corpora of novels, and saying like, writers write like each other in similar times. But of course we know, it's well known, right? For genre, of course, no writer even writes like him or herself. Right? If I'm writing a letter, and
actually turns out not to be true. So they all cluster together.
No, but I'm telling you, it's not. I can point to literature and say that that's not true. Right? So
that's stored
somewhere
in your memory palace.
We'll compare literature.
Yeah.
But this is a big problem because then again, like if you're picking collections of novels that in fact have been curated, then of course you're going to see them separate in particular ways. But that may have. There's character. Anyway, so I'm just sorry. So that's even longer than I wanted to go. Yeah. But. How have you addressed the problem of corpora in all of
Yeah, well, so I think the point is well taken. I'll give you a beautiful example that there's not much for me to say. Okay, we can discuss in a second, but I'll give you an example where this was really pressing, and it was in the Human Genome Project. So at a certain point, the federal agencies mandated that any sequence that resulted from federal funding had to be made publicly available in a large online repository. Called GenBank in the first incarnation. GenBank was the source of a huge number of papers where they analyzed the data rightly. GenBank now has been completely replaced. Everything in that first iteration, that first version of it was outrageously noisy and unreliable. That happened again in terms of levels of gene expression using microarrays and now in chip arrays. So there's a whole, so what happens is kind of interesting, and this is the process of, I would claim, research, right? You develop a technology, it's a noisy technology, in concert you develop means of analyzing and thinking about the data, but someone comes along and says, you know, I can give you much, much cleaner data, and you do it again, iteratively. So it's exactly the same here. Give you, in terms of the translation, so there is an encyclopedia of all constitutions that are internationally overseen by all contributing parties with large bodies of translators. This is not Google Translate. That doesn't mean that the translation is trivial. I mean, you know, maybe constitutions of that which is lost in translation. So I understand that's a challenge, and so I wouldn't deny it. No, it's not. But but nevertheless, so that I don't think that is a problem, but it's not the problem you describe. It's not some geek in Google saying, like, that's what it should say. But the general remark is well taken, and I think that your results are only as good as the observations you make, and the observations only get better. And so I can't argue with it. I think it's just true. Yeah.
Actually, I'll just say one thing. Yeah. And this also speaks to what Tom asked. There is often, I mean, the results that are stated in any of these papers are results based on the corpora, you know, and then, as you know, papers get written, discussions are written, this may suggest so and so, you know, but everything you get is a result with error bars, data set that you have. So, you know, the pictures you saw were the things that came out of the diffusion network machine, and that's exactly what it is. And if you ran a diffusion network machine on that data, you would get exactly that thing, and you would have your null model, you would compute the same error bars around everything that we got there, and, you know, and then you can ask, and it's a dialogue, you know, it's not like proving the law of gravitation. So it's here's a technique, here's a corpus, here's something we found, it's suggestive of some general phenomenon. Experts in the field opine one way or another, that was a dumb way to do it, an interesting way to do it, and you continue on. You know, I think with any sort of historical work, which is basically what we're talking about here, I think with the most culturomic work, you know, failing an exact corpus, which even any exact corpus doesn't take into account you know, all sorts of other things that were around when the corpus was actually created. But in that sense, all results are kind of hermetic, right? And then you have dialogues based on them, and hopefully the sort of hermitage grows. You know, I mean, you have to take all of it with a grain of salt and hope that you're edging towards some kind of general understanding. And the fact that the press likes to report answers, they don't like to report questions. You know, when you do, so having done some stylometry work, the first thing they ask me is, well, can you prove that so-and-so didn't do such and such? I said, you know, that's not really the interesting question. The interesting question was kind of, there's this trend, and, you know, they, well, I don't care about that. I really just I want the headline. So-and-so didn't write such and such. Can't help you. But that's what they want, and, you know, so that's the whole thing about how you sell newspapers and what gets reported.
I think it's also about primary education and secondary education in science.
Right. Teaching people to ask questions as opposed to just remembering facts or something. So that's a much broader conversation. So let's thank David again.